Hello, I'm Gillian Drake. I'm the director of New Works in Action at Spooky Action Theater. One of the plays you just watched, By a Lady, is the second play by Laura Shamas that we've workshopped this year. I have Laura with me here today to discuss her artistic process and offer some insight into her delightful work. As background, Laura grew up running around theaters in Oklahoma while her mother worked as an actor and director. Her lifelong love of theater led to playwriting and eventually to marrying a playwright. Her current projects are a new stage adaptation, transforming a play that hasn't been produced yet into a novel, and a television pilot. So thank you for coming, Laura, and thank you for talking to me. After seeing two of your plays performed, I'd like to start with a discussion of your work in general. Will you talk for a moment about your Native American heritage and its influence on your work? I think you just were at a conference about this, weren't you?
It wasn't a conference, it was Native Voices Short Play Festival, and I was honored to be a very small part of it. And I'd like to urge everyone watching this to support Native Voices. Native Voices at the Ottery is the only equity Native American theater that we have. And so I love them. And in terms of my Native heritage, you know, I was born in Oklahoma. My dad had Choctaw heritage. My mother had Chickasaw heritage. And I'm an enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation. But I'm a mixed race person, and you know, my last name is Arabic, and you know, so I also have European descent. I'm a, you know, kind of think of myself as an American person, and with these different heritages. So in terms of how it affected me and how it affects my writing, I will say I started writing in 1979. It was when I wrote my first full-length play that is still in publication, by the way, called The Other Shakespeare, and it was an adaptation about what Virginia Woolf's idea would look like as a full-length play, 4 pages from her book, A Room of One's Own. What if Shakespeare had had a genius sister? What would her life have been like? And then I wrote a full-length play about Amelia Earhart, and then I wrote an all Native American cast play about Sequoia in 1980. And so it has just always been a part of what I've written and who I am. My mother directed for what became the American Indian Theater of Tulsa. It wasn't called that at the time that she directed for them, but it just was always a part of who I am. My mother made sure that we all were aware of many aspects of what it meant to be Chickasaw, and Chickasaw lineage is matriarchal. And she is an official Chickasaw elder. So I could go on and on about what it means to me, but if you were wondering about the state of Native American theater, I urge you to look at Native Voices, the festival that they put on last weekend, which was live on Zoom with 9 different plays, 9 different directors, and 29 actors, you know, live in 100 minutes. It was fantastic. It was so rich. It was really a testimony to the incredible Native American talent that we have performing right now. And people, because of the pandemic, people were able to join from all over the country. So it was, I'm so proud to have been a small part of it. I wrote a really tough piece called 4 Women in Red that was about missing and murdered Indigenous women and the hashtag, you know, hashtag MMIW. And I wasn't even sure that you could perform a short protest choreo poem on Zoom, because that's what it is. It's a short protest choreo poem.
Wow.
That I'd like to expand, actually. But they did a beautiful job. I had a fantastic cast and director. And anyway, mine was just a small part of it, but it was a really fantastic experience. And the big piece that I've written this year is I've written a Native American adaptation of Wuthering Heights called Wuthering. That's a full-length play. I'm very excited about it. I love to decolonize things like classics from a Native American perspective. I hope that I did it justice. And I'm hoping to get a workshop of it in 2021 to see, how I did. But
Wow.
that's an example of how, and just last night for another theater, I wrote a monologue. It's just a first draft though, but it's for a piece that has multiple pieces. I wrote a monologue about Maria Tallchief and her incredible genius and career. Very hard to try and encapsulate that in 3 to 5 minutes, but I gave it a try, hoping that I get a chance to work on that too as part of this project. So I wrote to you, and if anyone reads The Dramatist, which I hope you do, the Dramatist Guild official magazine, right now in the November issue, there's a wonderful piece on Native American dramaturgy that I was very honored to be asked to be part of. And I got to discuss a little bit in there about how Circular, the show that you guys did such a beautiful job with at Spooky Action in June. I can't even tell you how many people have raved to me about the video, the live performance that Spooky Action did. It's just been wonderful to hear, and a real testimony to the artistry of Kate and the actors, who were just both so phenomenal. But anyway, Circular was discussed as a Native American construction because, and I believe that it is, and Jeanette Harrison, who directed it, who directed it in San Francisco, was the person who is of Native American heritage, was the first person who said that to me about it. And, the never-ending story structure of it is part of why that's so, because it's called Circular, and
Right.
and it's a round tale. So anyway, that's an example of how my Native American heritage would affect the structure or dramaturgy of a play that I think if a general audience saw it, they wouldn't necessarily know that about it, but it's there.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. It's amazing, all those connections, and I'm glad that you were able to talk about that festival that was the online festival from last week. And
last weekend, just a few days ago.
yeah, that's really fabulous. And so let's then let's go to another area, which is you seem to draw a lot from mythology and old stories that inform or obstruct, like in Circe, modern living, and it especially pertains to women. Like with Circe, I noted that you reinterpreted the relationship between Circe and Odysseus, giving it a modern context. You also wrote a book of essays called Pop Mythology, comparing ancient and modern female icons like Athena and Martha Stewart. Can you define pop mythology for us and its influence on your writing?
Well, let me back up a little bit. In the late 90s, I started wanting to pursue a PhD, and I looked around at different programs, and I ended up in a PhD program on mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology in Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California, which is a really, really interesting program. And the dissertation that I wrote, I might be one of the few people that's written a play about a subject and a dissertation as well. But I wrote a dissertation on Trinitarian witches in Shakespeare, or Trinitarian figures in Shakespeare, and really about how I see the witches in Macbeth how they got changed to become witches, because they were originally described as goddesses at the time they were written, and just how that changed from goddess to witch, and why I see that as a feminist issue, and how I think it's the most major imprint we have now in what a witch is. And that is the modern imprint we have for witch today. So if you're interested in that, I tell people that it's published. It's called We Three, about the mythology of Shakespeare's weird sisters. And it's been in print for a long time now, since 2006. But I was just interviewed about it in the upcoming issue of Bitch Media. I'm interviewed about this as well, about various aspects of my dissertation related to how we see pop culture figures of witches in film and TV. So I'm very excited that to be seen as, have my research be seen as still relevant. Yeah. But that's one way that I got into writing about myth. I also started in the late 90s as a graduate student, this was a very interesting process, but I got op-eds published from a mythology standpoint in the Los Angeles Times, in Newsday. Some were syndicated. It was very exciting to be asked to do that. Very exciting time for me as a writer. I went on and had a archetypal myth reviews of films that ran in Huffington Post.
Oh, wow.
Called Hit and Myth.
Wow.
And that actually was my specialty, I would say, is to be able to look at patterns in movies and to be able to see what the archetypal patterns were. You know, I can talk a little bit about myth, and a lot of myth is story, and that also relates for me to my Native American heritage as well. Right. But at the foundation of mythology is there are patterns and stories, and these patterns tell us something about who we are as humans. So for me, it's always been about the psychology of mythology and what it means to us today. So what I do, or what I used to do when I was a myth consultant for 15 years. I'm not allowed to say for which companies or for what products or what artistic products, because I
didn't even know that was a job. So I think
I didn't either, but the job came to me and word got around, and I really had a good time with it for 15 years. It was a very intellectually gratifying occupation for me. Somebody told me I was an inspirational myth speaker at one company, and I thought, well, I never really thought about that. Maybe that's what it is. But where I would help people be able to see that things that have ancient ties are still here with us, but you have to know how to interpret the pattern. And it is what we, as you would say in academia, it's hermeneutical, in that it's up to what my personal interpretation of it is. I can't tell you that everyone would see a certain pattern that way, but I always knew as a mythologist when I had a direct hit, when one of my interpretations resonated. You can tell if you're speaking to a room of people and you say something and they respond to it, or if you write something and people send you messages about it, or I can always tell when I hit the mark with some stuff, and that felt really good. And so what I tried to do in Circular, I had written about myth before. Paula Sismar is a fantastic playwright. She and I wrote a play called Venus in Orange, which was about, it was a commissioned play, but it was about young students in Orange, California, and aspects of dealing with love, and using the archetype of Aphrodite as a way to intersect stories about their lives. It was a very ambitious, also a choreo poem, a very ambitious project, and ultimately was produced at that college and then at the Victory Theater in Burbank. But I had not personally written a play that used the approach to myth that I used intellectually on the job. And I would go around, I would teach playwrights. I taught for 25 years. I would teach people how to use myth and how to adapt from myth in a way that maintained the myth. In other words, I think that there's an approach to adapting myth that to me is sort of like piracy, and that, you know, you pick out your favorite parts, and that's not necessarily what?
Exactly. They just take the plot and their favorite parts and they update it, so to speak. But that's
And
not
that doesn't always maintain the psychology of the myth.
exactly.
And so I had a specific methodology that I used to teach about that. It's actually in the book too, Pop Mythology. There's an adaptation chapter where I try and lay it out about what you need to maintain in order to have the psychology still be there for the power of the myth. But I thought, okay, well, I tell other people about this all the time. I'm going to write a play that uses this of my own. And that was one of the processes that I used with Circular, with writing Circular.
Well, so about,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So let's talk about Jane Austen and what inspired you to combine Jane Austen's later life with vampirism, albeit in a nice short play. Did you intend to connect this lecture on vampirism to her dependence on her brother Edward in the Chawton village?
That's such a good question, Gillian, and I'm just sadly not informed enough about her life to be able to say yes or no to that. Maybe is what I can say.
What brought you to Jane? I mean, Jane
well,
is
this is what I was going to say.
So I love this because it's this feminine icon that we have mythologized her somehow. Sorry about
mythologized her, yes.
Yes, so much so. So it seemed, but that's not what inspired you. How did it happen?
This is how it happened. I wrote this a long time ago, like at least a decade ago. And at the time that I wrote it, there was a lot of discussion of Jane Austen's juvenilia. And
early writings that never got, some of them got published, and yeah.
Right, and some of the aspects of her juvenilia are really gory, and like not the topics that you think of for Jane Austen at all. I mean, she was such a fabulous writer. I'm a huge fan of hers, of course, and I also think that her use of gory topics, or could have been related to satire as well. I mean, so I just started to think about, okay, they say that as we get close to our end days, that we become more like we were when we were young. And what could I write about that if I were trying to show Jane Austen near the end of her life, what would people, first of all, I don't like that this anti-Jane, the placid anti-Jane, I mentioned it in the script, that there was a view of her for a while that she was just this placid maiden aunt who wrote and observed society. But there has to be more than that. There has to be able to write as she did. And then you read the history of what happened to her work. Oh my gosh. It just breaks your heart to think that she had to go through, it's called By a Lady because she couldn't even print her name on it. I mean, that's a true thing. Her scripts were written by a lady, not even Jane Austen, on her work in her lifetime.
Right.
And I started thinking about how, oh my gosh, that would fill me with just absolute resentment. And then she had to buy her copyrights back of her own work. I mean, it's just.
And she couldn't title her own play. She had to have her brother or her father always being the
intermediary. Exactly. So I just started thinking about, okay, what would be a way to show some of the relationship to her juvenilia and also incorporate satire, where you were mentioning the brother. I think there are other aspects of it too, talking about vampires that could be satirical about society as well, maybe related to publishing. I mean, there's a lot that could be done with that metaphor. But also, I think a lot of people, I'll just put myself in this category. Before I did a lot of Bram Stoker research for another project, I mean, I didn't realize that in Jane Austen's time, there had been other things written about vampires fictionally. So I also researched in a general sense, not in a real scholarly sense, but I researched what the vampire tales were like at the time of her life. And that one of the things that's mentioned in By a Lady is a true thing that happened in the late, 18th century, which there were people stoning vampires and stuff like that in Europe. And, so some of it is not even that satirical related to the stories that circulated at her time. Do I know for sure she heard one? No, I don't. But, at the time that she lived, there were tales circulating of vampires already. And I mean, and in other countries, vampire novels were going to be written soon. And, I'm not even talking about Dracula. So,
putting them together. Oh, that's very cool. I love that. Now, you did end up, I guess this is a slightly older play. You chose a short form for this as opposed to a long form. I guess I love short form. I think that the plays that we've gotten in this series have been this entire theatrical moment, right? In 10 minutes, but it has a beginning, middle, and end, and has purpose. So do you have, you chose this as a short form. Do you have any insight into, it's not just a not long play, right? It's kind of a form to writing a complete play in 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, and as I wrote to you, I don't really consider myself a writer of short plays yet. No. I mean, I have a whole bunch that have been done in the last decade or so. I'm very grateful. I had another one that was supposed to go up in New York in May that was canceled due to the pandemic, a short play that was produced in LA in 2018. And then because of the pandemic, it didn't happen in New York, but it was on a podcast instead. And, so I do get a lot of activity around short plays. And my theory about them is this: it's not a deep theory, but it's a theory, is that you have to start in the middle of action.
Yes.
You have to start in medias res with them, and you better get in and get out, and you better have an ending. I think there's actually more of an onus to have a good ending, I would say, that makes an impact on a short play. I used to teach short fiction and 1 minute short stories and things like that, and flash fiction. And when you do that, it's the same thing. You've just got to do it. It's got to make an impact. And I really think that short plays, it's the same thing. But I will say, so let me just say a little bit more about By a Lady. I had never heard it before. So I only sent it 2 places in 10 years, and Spooky Action was the 3rd. And it's only because you guys asked for impossible plays.
Yes.
But I thought, well, this must be impossible.
It fit right in. It fit. Right in. It didn't have to be new, but it hasn't been produced that much. That's nice. And
I never even heard it aloud until I got to the rehearsal.
Oh, that's so great.
It was really fantastic. First of all, Colleen and Emily are so brilliant in it. They just were a joy to watch, and of course, Kate is a fantastic director, and it just was a joy all the way around. But I got to tell you, from watching them, I got to watch them for 4 hours or more. And I started to get inspired about, okay, I wrote this as a short play. Obviously, you can see at the end of the play where I'm going, what I'm saying about Jane and her life, but where this point is in her life. But would it be possible to expand this play? And if I did, how would that be? And, is the next scene that we see Jane and Emily in a spaceship going to Mars? Or, I'm kidding actually about
where
that.
Where will Jane take us next?
Yes.
Yeah, really, and you're right. Colleen is such a wonderful actress, and she, you could watch her blossom over the 4 hours to become this Jane Austen-like little lady, right? It's a little baddie, right? So it's a marvelous character, and it's not exactly how we think of Jane Austen, but as soon as she starts wheeling out her new story, it's very much like a Jane Austen. I mean, it's not like a plot, but I just think it's a brilliant take on her and her character. And we don't think really about her, embody her. We think about her. She must be one of those characters in her novels. So you gave us a real thought about that. So
well, thank you.
I really, I really appreciate you talking to us, Laura. It's been so much fun. I learned so much, and it was a nice, wide-ranging conversation. So thank you for joining us, and I thank the audience for staying and listening to the conversation with us. And I hope to just have everybody back again to talk about the next set of short plays. Thanks,
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
Bye,
you,
Laura.
everybody.